Hey guys! Welcome back to Sleeping Stone Whispers, a place where nothing urgent happens and time moves very slowly. Tonight's story follows noble children learning to dress themselves, button by button, layer by layer, without hurry or excitement. If you enjoy quiet routines, gentle details, and stories that help your mind loosen and drift, you're in the right place. Settle in, give this video a like, and subscribe to Sleeping Stone Whispers so you never miss another peaceful night. The morning bell rang softly somewhere deep within the noble household, though it was not a bell meant to startle or command attention. It was a familiar sound, low and patient, echoing faintly through long corridors that had heard the same sound every day for many years. The bell did not rush anyone. It simply existed, as it always had, marking the beginning of another ordinary morning. In the children's sleeping chamber, nothing happened immediately. The air remained still. Heavy blankets lay unmoving, and the tall windows allowed only a thin, pale light to rest against the walls. The bell faded, and silence returned to its usual place, as though it had never been disturbed at all. The noble children were awake in the slowest possible way. Not fully awake, not fully asleep. Their breathing remained even, and their thoughts had not yet formed into anything clear. Morning, for them, was not a moment but a gradual process. It took time. It always did. The room itself seemed designed for waiting. The wooden floor was cool and polished smooth by years of quiet footsteps. A long wardrobe stood against the far wall, its doors closed, its contents unchanged since the previous evening. Chairs rested where they had been placed, neither inviting nor unwelcoming. Everything waited. Eventually, one child shifted slightly beneath the covers. It was not an important movement. It did not signal anything dramatic. It simply happened, as small movements often do. Another child opened their eyes but did not sit up. There was no reason to hurry. The morning would remain whether they rose now or later. Outside the room, servants moved carefully through the halls, their steps measured and quiet. They knew better than to bring energy into the morning too quickly. This hour belonged to stillness. Even voices, when used, were low and brief. Inside the chamber, the children began to notice the temperature of the air. It was cool, but not unpleasant. Cool enough to remind them that blankets would eventually be left behind, and that dressing would come later. Not yet, but later. The bell rang again, softer this time, as though confirming what everyone already knew. It was morning. It was time to begin the day. Slowly. One child sat up, carefully, letting the blanket fold naturally rather than tossing it aside. Another followed after a long pause. Their expressions were neutral, calm, unchanged. They had seen many mornings like this one, and this morning offered nothing new. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary. The routine was familiar enough that silence felt appropriate. Each child sat at the edge of the bed, feet hovering briefly above the floor before touching down. The floor was cool, exactly as expected. They remained there for a while, simply sitting. This pause was part of the process. The body adjusted. The mind caught up. No one rushed ahead. Across the room, the wardrobe stood patiently. It had stood there yesterday, and the day before that, and would stand there again tomorrow. Inside it waited linen shirts, stockings, coats, and shoes, each folded, placed and arranged in the same way every morning. Nothing inside the wardrobe wondered when it would be used. It knew it would be. The children glanced toward it, but made no move yet. Dressing was not the first task of the morning. Awareness came first. Stillness came second. Dressing would come later. Light crept a little further into the room, touching the edges of furniture and the corners of the walls. Dust moved gently in the air, visible only when the light found it. The children watched without much thought, letting the moment stretch. Eventually, one child stood. The others followed, unhurried and quiet. The day had officially begun, though it did not feel different from the many days before it. The morning bell had done its job. Nothing more was required of it. And so, with calm minds and untroubled movements, the children prepared, slowly, patiently, for the simple task of learning to dress themselves, one ordinary morning at a time. The noble household did not believe in sudden awakenings. Morning was allowed to arrive slowly, as if it needed time to decide whether it truly wished to begin. In the children's chamber, the fire in the hearth had not yet been fully lit. Only a faint warmth lingered from the night before, resting quietly in the stones. The children stood near their beds, not moving much, simply existing in the space between sleep and activity. Their posture was relaxed, their thoughts still soft and indistinct. There was no sharp boundary between night and day here, only a gradual change. One child rubbed their hands together gently, more out of habit than necessity. Another adjusted the hem of their night garment, smoothing it down as though it mattered greatly. These were small actions, but they filled the time without rushing it. The hearth remained mostly dark. A servant would come later to tend to it properly, but for now, the room accepted its mild chill. The children had learned that mornings were not meant to be perfectly comfortable. Slight discomfort encouraged awareness. Awareness encouraged patience. They moved slowly toward the washstand, where a simple bowl of water waited. The water was cool, just as it always was. Each child dipped their fingers in briefly, then withdrew them, pausing afterward as if reflecting on the sensation. No one splashed. No one hurried. Afterward, they returned to standing quietly in the center of the room. Time passed. It was unclear how much. The household did not measure mornings by minutes, but by readiness. Outside the chamber, a servant passed by with careful steps, carrying kindling for the fire. The sound of wood shifting was faint and distant, barely noticeable. The children did not look toward the door. They already knew what the sound meant. One of them glanced again at the wardrobe. The doors were still closed. Dressing had not begun yet. This pause, too, was part of learning. They were being taught, without words, that preparation mattered as much as action. They waited until the fire was properly lit. It was a rule, though not a strict one. Dressing before warmth felt incomplete. When the hearth finally crackled softly, the sound was reassuring rather than exciting. It suggested steadiness, not urgency. The firelight added a gentle glow to the room, changing nothing except the color of the walls. Shadows became softer. The air felt slightly kinder. The children acknowledged the change with quiet nods, as if greeting an old acquaintance. Still, they did not rush to the wardrobe. Instead, they sat again, this time on a bench near the hearth. The warmth touched their hands and faces gradually. They let it. There was no need to absorb it all at once. One child practiced folding and unfolding their fingers. Another rested their hands neatly in their lap. These motions had been seen many times before, passed down through repetition rather than instruction. The fire settled into a steady burn. Nothing dramatic happened. The household liked it that way. Finally, when the room felt balanced, neither too cold nor too warm, the children rose. This moment, though unannounced, felt correct. It always did. They approached the wardrobe together, standing before it without opening it immediately. This pause was important. Dressing was not merely about clothing, it was about order. About sequence. About doing things the same way every day so the mind could rest. One child reached for the handle, then stopped. They waited a moment longer, listening to the fire, feeling the floor beneath their feet, breathing evenly. Then, and only then, the wardrobe door opened with a soft, familiar sound. Inside, the clothing waited patiently. The day moved forward, not quickly, not loudly, but exactly as it was meant to. The heavy curtains had been drawn since the night before, resting in thick folds on either side of the tall windows. They were made of deep, muted fabric, designed to keep out both cold and distraction. In the early morning, they did their job well. Only a thin line of pale light slipped through the narrow gap between them, resting quietly on the floor. The children noticed the light without reacting to it. Light arrived every morning. It was neither surprising nor important. Still, it marked time in a way nothing else could. One child stepped closer to the window, their movement slow and deliberate. They did not touch the curtains yet. Touching them too soon would feel like rushing. Instead, they stood still, watching how the light gradually widened on the wooden floor as the morning advanced. The room remained quiet except for the soft sound of the fire and the occasional settling of old beams in the walls. These sounds were familiar, comforting in their predictability. The household had been built to hold silence gently, not to break it. After a long pause, the child reached for the curtain's edge. The fabric felt heavy, as it always did. Pulling it back required effort, but not strain. The curtain moved slowly, allowing more light to enter the room in an unhurried way. The light did not flood in. It simply expanded, touching furniture, warming colors, and revealing nothing new. The same wardrobe stood against the wall. The same chairs waited where they had been left. Dust particles drifted lazily, visible only when the light found them. The other children watched without speaking. They had seen this done many times before. Sometimes they took turns with the curtains. Sometimes the same child did it every day. It did not matter. When both curtains were finally drawn back, the windows revealed a quiet view of the estate grounds. The garden paths lay undisturbed. The trees stood still, their leaves barely moving. Morning had arrived, but it brought no urgency with it. The children stood together for a moment, looking out. There was nothing specific to observe. No event to comment on. This, too, was part of the morning. Looking without expectation. Eventually, they turned away from the window and returned their attention to the wardrobe. The clothing inside now appeared slightly brighter in the increased light. Linen shirts showed their pale folds clearly. Stockings lay rolled with care. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before. One child reached inside and removed a folded shirt, holding it carefully with both hands. They did not put it on yet. First, they examined it, smoothing the fabric gently, checking its shape. This inspection was not strictly necessary, but it was encouraged. Another child selected a pair of stockings and placed them neatly on a chair, aligning them carefully. Precision mattered. Not because anyone would notice, but because order brought calm. The children worked quietly, each focusing on their own small task. No one corrected anyone else. Mistakes were not urgent matters. They could be fixed slowly, without embarrassment. Outside, the light continued to grow stronger, though the children paid little attention to it now. Their world was the room, the routine, and the quiet sequence of actions that unfolded each morning. One child folded an extra garment that would not be needed yet and returned it to the wardrobe. Another adjusted the placement of shoes on the floor so they faced the same direction. These actions carried no excitement, but they carried meaning. Time passed gently. The curtains remained open, the fire burned steadily, and the children prepared themselves for the next step in their routine. Dressing had begun, not with sleeves or buttons, but with attention and patience. Nothing remarkable happened. And that was exactly how the household preferred it. The wooden floor greeted the children as it always did, cool, smooth, and completely indifferent to their presence. It had been polished many times over the years, not to shine brightly, but to remain even and reliable. Each plank fit neatly beside the next, forming a surface that asked nothing more than to be walked upon. The children stood barefoot for a moment, letting the cold travel upward through their feet. This sensation was expected. It was not unpleasant, only noticeable. The household believed that noticing small things helped the mind settle. Cold floors served this purpose well. They shifted their weight slowly, one foot and then the other, testing the temperature without comment. No one hurried to put on stockings yet. That would come later. For now, standing was enough. The room held its silence carefully. Even the fire seemed to burn quietly, its soft crackle barely interrupting the stillness. The curtains remained open, letting light rest gently across the floor. Dust continued its slow movement through the air, unnoticed unless one chose to watch. One child took a careful step forward, then another. Their footsteps were soft, almost absorbed by the wood beneath them. Walking across the room did not require speed. It required balance and attention, both of which were learned over time. A chair was moved slightly, its legs sliding gently across the floor. The sound was mild and brief. Afterward, everything returned to silence. The children paused, as though listening to ensure nothing else needed adjusting. They began placing garments nearby, but not yet on themselves. A shirt was laid across the back of a chair. Stockings were positioned neatly at the foot of the bed. Shoes were aligned again, even though they had already been aligned earlier. Repetition was not wasted effort here. It was reassurance. One child bent down to examine the floor closely, brushing away a speck of dust that had settled near the edge of a rug. The action was small and unnecessary, but it felt appropriate. Tidiness before dressing made the process feel complete. Another child stood still near the wardrobe, hands folded calmly in front of them. They waited without impatience. Waiting was not seen as empty time. It was part of the lesson. The cold floor gradually became less noticeable as the children adjusted. Sensations softened when given time. This, too, was something they were learning, even if no one said it aloud. The silence stretched comfortably. It did not demand conversation. It did not create discomfort. It simply existed, filling the room evenly. Eventually, one child picked up a stocking and held it thoughtfully. They did not put it on yet. First, they checked the opening, then the length, then smoothed it gently between their fingers. This careful attention slowed the morning even further, exactly as intended. Another child sat down on the edge of the bed, feet still resting on the floor. They watched their toes for a moment, then adjusted their posture slightly. Sitting correctly mattered. Not because anyone was watching, but because posture shaped habit. The floor continued to support them without complaint. Somewhere deeper in the household, a door closed softly. The sound did not echo. The walls absorbed it. The children did not react. The room remained unchanged. When the time felt right. Though no clock marked it, the children began preparing to dress properly. Not yet dressing, only preparing. A stocking was placed closer. A shirt was unfolded more fully. Shoes were nudged just slightly forward. These movements were slow and deliberate, as though the morning itself had weight and needed to be handled carefully. The wooden floor stayed cool. The silence stayed intact. The routine moved forward without hurry. And so, with cold feet, steady breathing, and calm minds, the children continued toward the next simple step of their day, learning not just how to dress, but how to do nothing quickly at all. The wardrobe stood against the far wall, tall and unmoving, its surface darkened slightly by age and careful polishing. It had been there longer than the children could remember, and it looked exactly as it always had. The doors were closed, the handles cool to the touch, the hinges silent and dependable. Even though the wardrobe had already been opened earlier in the morning, there was a sense that it had not yet truly been opened. Not in the proper way. The children believed that actions could be repeated with intention, and that intention mattered more than sequence. They approached the wardrobe again, standing before it without touching it. This pause was deliberate. Opening the wardrobe too quickly felt careless. Clothing deserved acknowledgement before being used. One child rested their hand near the handle but did not grasp it. They waited, breathing evenly, allowing the moment to settle. The others stood beside them, still and patient, their attention focused without tension. The room remained quiet. The fire burned steadily. Light from the window rested along the wardrobe's surface, revealing faint lines in the wood that told of many mornings just like this one. At last, the handle was turned. The door opened with a soft sound, neither loud nor dramatic. Inside, the clothing appeared once more, linen shirts folded carefully, woolen garments stacked evenly, stockings rolled with practiced precision. Nothing had changed since the earlier glance. Still, looking again felt important. Each child selected a garment, one at a time. They did not reach in together. Order mattered. One shirt was removed and held briefly before being placed on a chair. Another garment followed. The wardrobe was never rushed. A child adjusted a stack inside, even though it did not strictly need adjusting. The edges were aligned, the folds refined. The wardrobe seemed to accept this attention quietly. After all necessary items were removed, the door was closed again, not sharply, but gently, until it rested in its frame. The wardrobe returned to its stillness, having served its purpose for now. The children turned away, carrying their clothing carefully. No garment touched the floor. Each was placed deliberately, as though it might be needed to wait a little longer before being worn. One child unfolded a shirt slowly, smoothing each crease. Another examined a sleeve to ensure it was not twisted. These checks took time. Time was available. They sat down, each in their own place, holding their clothing without putting it on yet. Sitting with the garments was part of the learning. It reminded them that dressing was not a single act, but a series of small, calm decisions. The silence continued without interruption. No instructions were given. No corrections were made. The children knew what to do, even if they did not always do it perfectly. Eventually, a stocking was picked up again. This time, it was turned inside out slightly, then corrected. The action was slow and careful. No frustration appeared. Frustration had no place in the morning. The wardrobe remained closed behind them, its role complete for now. It would not be needed again until later, and it was content with that. The children sat quietly, clothing arranged neatly around them, minds steady and untroubled. Dressing was close now. Very close. But not yet. The routine moved forward at its own gentle pace, as it always did, and the noble household remained calm, orderly, and entirely unconcerned with speed. The linen shirts rested quietly where they had been placed, pale and unassuming, their folds neat and familiar. Each shirt had been folded in exactly the same way every day, for as long as anyone could remember. This was not because other folding methods were forbidden, but because consistency made decisions unnecessary. One child lifted a shirt carefully, holding it by the shoulders. The fabric felt cool and light, softer from many washings. Linen had a way of remembering how it liked to be handled, and the children had learned to respect that. They unfolded the shirt slowly, one section at a time, allowing the fabric to settle naturally. Sleeves were straightened. Creases were smoothed with the palm of the hand. No sharp movements were used. Sharp movements created disorder. Another child followed the same steps nearby, unfolding their own shirt in the same familiar sequence. They did not compare their progress. There was no need. Each shirt required its own attention. Once unfolded, the shirts were held briefly, as though being considered. The children examined the collars, the seams, the small buttons sewn carefully down the front. Everything appeared as it should. If a thread was loose, it would be noticed later. There was no urgency to find it now. The children sat quietly with the shirts resting across their laps. This pause allowed the fabric to warm slightly, making it more comfortable to wear. It also allowed the children to settle further into the rhythm of the morning. One child traced a finger along the edge of a sleeve, feeling the stitching beneath their touch. Another adjusted the shirt's position so it lay more evenly. These actions were small and repetitive, but repetition was reassuring. Eventually, one child lifted the shirt and prepared to put it on. They did not stand immediately. Instead, they adjusted their posture, ensuring they were sitting upright and balanced. Dressing while slouched was discouraged, not strictly, but gently. The shirt was raised slowly, guided over the head with care. Sleeves were found one at a time, never rushed. If a hand did not find the sleeve opening immediately, the child paused rather than forcing it. Forcing caused mistakes. Once the shirt rested on the shoulders, it was adjusted again. The fabric was pulled gently downward, allowing it to fall naturally. No tugs were sharp. Everything was deliberate. Another child began the same process, slightly behind in timing but identical in method. The room remained quiet except for the faint sound of fabric moving. Linen made very little noise when treated properly. Buttons were not fastened yet. That would come later. For now, the shirts simply rested where they belonged, open and unbuttoned, sleeves hanging loosely. The children sat for a moment after putting on their shirts, allowing themselves to feel the weight, or rather, the lack of it. Linen was light, almost forgettable. That was its purpose. One child adjusted a sleeve that had bunched slightly near the wrist. Another smoothed the front of the shirt again, even though it was already smooth. These refinements were not strictly necessary, but they were satisfying. Time passed without notice. The children did not speak. Words would have added nothing. The act of dressing spoke for itself, quietly and steadily. When all shirts were properly in place, the children sat still again, hands resting calmly in their laps. The shirts were worn, but the dressing was not complete. There were still many steps to come. The linen shirts, folded the same way every day, had fulfilled their role. They had been unfolded, examined, and worn without incident. The morning continued without change, without excitement, and without hurry, exactly as it was meant to. The buttons waited. They were small, round, and pale, sewn carefully onto the linen shirts with matching thread. Each button sat in its place without movement, doing nothing at all. They had done this for years, waiting quietly to be fastened, then waiting again to be unfastened at the end of the day. The children looked down at the buttons without urgency. Buttoning was not something to be rushed. It required attention, steady hands, and patience, all of which were learned slowly over time. One child lifted the lower edge of their shirt slightly, examining the line of buttons from bottom to top. They always began at the bottom. This was the preferred method, though no one remembered exactly why. It simply felt correct. They pinched the first button gently between their fingers and guided it toward the buttonhole. The fabric resisted slightly, as fabric often does. The child paused, adjusted their grip, and tried again. There was no frustration. Resistance was expected. When the button finally slipped through the hole, the child paused again. This pause mattered. It allowed them to acknowledge the completion of a single step before moving on to the next. Another child began the same process nearby, their movements similar but not identical. Each pair of hands had its own rhythm. The household allowed for this difference, as long as the rhythm remained slow. The room filled with the faintest sound of fabric shifting and buttons brushing against linen. These sounds were soft and steady, blending easily with the crackle of the fire and the quiet presence of the room. One button took longer than the others. The buttonhole was slightly tighter, or perhaps the angle was not quite right. The child paused, loosened their fingers, and tried again. They did not sigh. Sighing suggested impatience. Eventually, the button went through. The child smoothed the fabric gently, ensuring it lay flat. Then they moved on to the next button. Time passed. It was difficult to say how much. The children did not look at one another to see who was ahead. Progress was not compared. Each button fastened was enough on its own. Halfway up the shirt, one child realized they had missed a buttonhole. The alignment was slightly off. Without comment, they unfastened the last button and corrected it. Mistakes were treated as part of the process, not interruptions to it. Another child reached the collar and paused again. The top button was always optional, but it still deserved consideration. After a moment, they fastened it, then adjusted the collar carefully so it did not feel tight. When all buttons were finally fastened, the children sat quietly, feeling the subtle difference. A buttoned shirt felt more complete. It held the body gently, offering structure without pressure. One child ran their fingers lightly down the line of buttons, checking that each was secure. Another tugged the hem slightly to ensure the shirt sat evenly. These final checks were unhurried and calm. The buttons had done their work. They would not be needed again until later, and they seemed content with that. The children rested their hands in their laps once more, posture straight, breathing steady. The room remained unchanged. The light was steady. The fire was steady. The morning was steady. Buttoning had taken time, exactly as it was supposed to. Nothing else happened for a while. The children remained seated, fully buttoned now, ready for the next small step in their routine. There was no sense of accomplishment, only quiet continuation. The buttons, once waiting, were now fastened. The process was complete. The day moved forward gently, without any need to hurry it along. The question of sleeves had been considered many times in the noble household, though it was never discussed openly. There was no official rule about which sleeve should come first, and yet the children knew that choosing one calmly mattered more than choosing the correct one. They sat quietly, shirts now buttoned, sleeves resting loosely at their wrists. The linen moved gently when they shifted, reminding them that even finished tasks could still require attention. One child lifted their right arm slightly and examined the sleeve. It sat comfortably, but perhaps not perfectly. The cuff felt uneven. They lowered their arm again, thinking without words. Another child lifted their left arm instead, smoothing the sleeve downward with slow, deliberate strokes. This motion was repeated once, then again. Repetition brought order. The children learned early that sleeves were not simply worn, they were adjusted. A sleeve that sat too high or too low would remain noticeable throughout the day. Taking time now prevented distraction later. One child decided to begin with the right sleeve, gently tugging it downward until the cuff rested properly at the wrist. They paused, then adjusted it again, just slightly. Satisfied, they moved on to the left sleeve. The other child did the opposite, starting with the left sleeve first. This difference was allowed. What mattered was consistency within the moment, not uniformity across the room. The sound of fabric moving was soft and regular. No snapping or pulling disturbed the quiet. Hands moved slowly, guided by habit rather than instruction. At one point, a sleeve twisted slightly. The child noticed immediately and stopped. They lifted the fabric carefully, rotated it back into place, and smoothed it again. The correction was so gentle it barely altered the air. After adjusting both sleeves, the children rested their hands on their knees. This pause was important. It allowed them to feel whether the sleeves were truly comfortable or merely acceptable. One child lifted an arm again, testing the movement. The sleeve stayed in place. That was good. Another child noticed that one cuff sat a fraction lower than the other. They adjusted it once more, then once again, until the difference no longer drew attention. Precision, here, was quiet and personal. Time passed slowly. The children did not speak to ask if they were doing it correctly. They trusted the routine. The routine had never failed them before. When all sleeves felt settled, the children sat still, eyes unfocused, attention resting on nothing in particular. The act of sleeve adjusting had ended, and the body accepted the result. The room remained unchanged. The curtains hung open. The fire burned evenly. The wardrobe stood closed. Sleeves, once uncertain, now rested exactly where they should. The children had learned, not through instruction, but through repetition, that choosing calmly mattered more than choosing quickly. The morning moved forward, as it always did, with no urgency and no resistance. The sleeves were done. Nothing else happened for a while. And that was enough. The stockings waited where they had been placed earlier, resting neatly near the edge of the bed. They were long, soft, and familiar, made to be worn every day without drawing attention to themselves. Their color was muted, their texture even, their purpose simple. The children looked at the stockings for a while before touching them. There was no rule that required this pause, but it had become part of the routine. Pausing helped them remember that even ordinary objects deserved calm handling. One child picked up a stocking and held it by the top edge. It hung downward, stretching slightly under its own weight. The child examined it briefly, checking that it was not twisted. Satisfied, they laid it flat across their lap. Slowly, they began to roll it. Not tightly, not loosely, just enough to keep it orderly. The fabric moved smoothly beneath their fingers, folding into itself without resistance. When the stocking was fully rolled, the child paused again, holding it still. After a moment, they unrolled it. This was not a mistake. It was intentional. Rolling and unrolling helped the fabric relax and made it easier to put on. The children had learned this through repetition, not explanation. Another child followed the same steps nearby. Their rolling was slightly slower, their unrolling slightly more careful. Both methods were acceptable. The stockings made almost no sound. If listened to closely, there was only the faintest whisper of fabric moving. The room remained quiet enough that even this small sound felt noticeable. Once unrolled, the stocking was adjusted so the heel faced the correct direction. The child turned it slightly, then turned it back, checking alignment. Accuracy mattered, but perfection was not demanded. They bent forward slowly and guided the stocking over their foot. Toes entered first, one by one, followed by the rest of the foot. The child paused when the stocking reached the heel, making sure it settled properly before pulling further. Another child did the same, stopping briefly at the ankle to smooth the fabric. No wrinkles were ignored. Wrinkles became distractions later. The stocking was drawn upward in small movements, not one long pull. Each adjustment was followed by a pause. The fabric rested gently against the leg, even and steady. When the stocking reached its final position, the child smoothed it once more, then again. Satisfied, they rested their foot flat on the floor and waited. The second stocking was treated with the same care. rolled, unrolled, aligned, and guided slowly into place. The process took time, but time was available. One child noticed that the top of their stocking sat slightly lower than the other. They adjusted it carefully, then checked again. The difference disappeared, and with it, any need for further adjustment. The children sat quietly for a moment after both stockings were on. This pause allowed them to notice how the cold floor no longer felt as cold. The stockings softened the sensation, making the room feel more settled. They shifted their feet gently, testing comfort. Nothing needed changing. Nearby, a chair creaked faintly as a child adjusted their position. The sound faded quickly, absorbed by the room. The stockings, now worn properly, were no longer the focus. They had become part of the body's quiet arrangement, unnoticed unless something felt wrong, which it did not. The children placed their hands in their laps and sat still again. The routine moved forward without comment. Stockings had been rolled, unrolled, and worn. The task was complete, though it had taken its time. The morning remained calm. Nothing unexpected occurred. Nothing demanded attention. And so, with warm feet and steady minds, the children prepared, slowly and patiently, for the next small step in learning to dress themselves. The laces waited beside the shoes, long and still, resting exactly where they had been left. They were plain and practical, neither too stiff nor too soft, and they showed no urgency about being used. Laces, like many things in the noble household, understood the value of patience. The children sat down carefully, feet placed flat on the floor. Shoes were drawn closer, though not yet put on. Before tying came preparation, and preparation was never rushed. One child picked up a lace and held it loosely between their fingers. They did not begin tying immediately. First, they examined the ends, checking that they were even. Uneven ends caused uneven knots, and uneven knots could feel distracting. Another child ran their fingers slowly along the length of the lace, smoothing it as they went. This motion was familiar and calming, and it helped the lace lie flat. When the time felt right, the child crossed the laces gently, forming the beginning of a knot. They paused here, holding the shape without tightening it. This pause allowed them to confirm that everything was aligned. The knot was tightened slowly, not pulled sharply. The lace settled into place with quiet cooperation. The child stopped again, breathing evenly, then continued. Forming the loops took time. Fingers moved carefully, remembering each step through practice rather than thought. If a loop collapsed, the child simply tried again, without frustration. Nearby, another child struggled briefly with a lace that had twisted. They noticed the twist, straightened it, and began again from the beginning. Starting over was not seen as failure, it was seen as part of learning. The room remained quiet, filled only with the faint sound of laces sliding against one another and the soft shift of bodies adjusting posture. No one spoke. Words were unnecessary. One knot took longer than the others. The loops refused to sit evenly, and the child paused several times before continuing. Each pause brought clarity, and eventually, the knot rested properly. When both shoes were tied, the children sat still for a moment, feet resting evenly on the floor. They tested the knots gently, pressing their toes downward and lifting their heels slightly. Nothing loosened. That was good. One child retied a knot anyway, just to be certain. Certainty mattered more than speed. The mystery of knots remained a quiet one. No explanation ever seemed to fully explain why they sometimes worked easily and sometimes did not. Accepting this mystery made the task easier. With the knots complete, the children placed their hands in their laps again and sat quietly. Shoes were on. Feet were warm. The floor felt familiar beneath them. The routine had advanced another small step, without disturbance or excitement. Nothing else happened for a while. The laces, now tied, rested peacefully. They would not be touched again until later in the day. And so, with simple knots completed slowly and carefully, the children remained seated, calm and unhurried, ready, eventually, for whatever small task came next. The shoes had been waiting since the previous evening, placed side by side with care and left undisturbed through the night. Their position had not changed. They faced the same direction, their toes aligned, their laces resting neatly on top. Shoes, in the noble household, were expected to wait patiently. The children looked down at their shoes, now worn properly, and acknowledged them without expression. There was no excitement in putting on shoes. Shoes were practical. They existed to be worn, not admired. One child adjusted the position of their feet slightly, ensuring both shoes rested evenly on the floor. Another pressed a heel gently against the ground, feeling the firmness beneath. These small checks were done slowly and without urgency. The shoes felt familiar. They had been worn many times before, and they offered no surprises. Familiarity was valued. It allowed the mind to remain calm. One child noticed that a lace tip had shifted slightly to one side. They bent down and corrected it, placing it back in line with the other lace. Order restored itself quietly. Another child stood briefly, then sat again. Standing was not required yet. Sitting felt appropriate. The routine allowed for such small decisions, as long as they were made calmly. The room remained unchanged. Light continued to rest softly across the floor. The fire burned evenly. The wardrobe stayed closed. Shoes, once placed side by side the night before, now supported the children as they sat. Their soles rested flat. Their weight felt balanced. Nothing felt wrong. One child examined the toe of their shoe, noticing a faint mark from previous wear. They brushed it lightly with their fingers, not to remove it, but simply to acknowledge it. Marks told stories, though these stories were rarely interesting. The children placed their feet neatly together, then apart again, testing comfort. The shoes responded as expected. No adjustments were needed. Time passed slowly. Eventually, one child rose to stand properly. They placed their weight carefully, ensuring both feet were steady. Another followed after a pause. Standing felt different from sitting, but not unfamiliar. They remained standing for a moment, hands resting calmly at their sides. This pause allowed them to feel whether anything needed correction. Nothing did. The shoes stayed where they belonged, aligned and quiet. They did not creak. They did not demand attention. Satisfied, the children sat again. Standing had not been the next step after all. The routine moved according to feeling, not schedule. Shoes had been acknowledged. Their role was complete for now. The morning continued in its steady, uneventful way. No instructions were given. No lessons were announced. Learning happened quietly through repetition. The shoes, placed side by side since yesterday, remained reliable and unchanged. The buckles waited near the belts and shoes, small pieces of metal that reflected the morning light without asking for attention. They were simple in design, made to be useful rather than decorative. Buckles did not mind waiting. They had waited many times before. The children sat down again, though they had stood only briefly before. Sitting felt right for adjusting buckles. Standing required balance, sitting allowed focus. One child picked up a belt and held it across their lap. The leather was smooth and worn, shaped over time by repeated use. The buckle rested at one end, cool against their fingers. They did not fasten it immediately. First, they ran their thumbs slowly along the belt's edge, checking for twists. A twisted belt would never sit comfortably. Another child lifted their own belt and did the same, their movements slightly slower, their attention steady. Neither child spoke. The task required quiet. When ready, the belt was wrapped gently around the waist. The child paused, ensuring it sat evenly. Then the buckle was guided toward the nearest hole. The metal slipped through with a faint sound, barely audible. The child adjusted the tightness once, then again, loosening it slightly before fastening it properly. Comfort mattered more than firmness. Nearby, another buckle resisted at first. The hole did not align easily. The child paused, shifted the belt, and tried again. There was no irritation. Buckles sometimes needed patience. Once fastened, the buckle was centered carefully. A slight adjustment brought it into alignment. The belt settled into place. The children rested their hands briefly on their waists, feeling the difference. A belt changed how clothing rested, how the body moved. Noticing this change was part of learning. One child unfastened the buckle again, adjusted the belt by a fraction, and fastened it once more. This repetition was not wasteful. It was deliberate. The room remained quiet, holding the sound of metal against leather without echo. The fire continued its steady burn. The light remained soft. After all buckles were properly adjusted, the children sat still again. This pause allowed them to sense whether the belts felt right. No adjustments followed. That was a good sign. Buckles, once fastened, became invisible. They held things together without calling attention to themselves. This quality was admired. The children placed their hands neatly in their laps and waited. The routine moved forward without announcement. Nothing else happened for a while. The buckles had been adjusted without any hurry, exactly as intended. The morning continued its gentle progress, undisturbed and calm. The woolen garments waited folded nearby, thicker and heavier than the linen shirts beneath them. Wool carried a certain seriousness with it. It did not move lightly. It required consideration before being worn. The children looked at the folded wool for a long moment. They knew what it would feel like once on their shoulders. They had worn it many times before. Still, each morning asked them to notice it again. One child lifted a woolen garment carefully, using both hands. The weight was noticeable but not burdensome. It rested in their hands with quiet certainty. Wool did not shift easily. It held its shape. They unfolded it slowly, letting the fabric fall into place without shaking it. Shaking would disturb the stillness. The garment was laid across their lap, where it remained for a moment, unmoving. Another child followed the same steps, unfolding their own garment with care. The sound of wool moving was softer than expected, a muted rustle that faded quickly. Before putting the garment on, the children paused. This pause allowed them to prepare for the change. Wool altered posture. It encouraged steadiness. One child stood slowly and lifted the garment over their shoulders. They guided their arms into the sleeves with patience, adjusting the fabric so it rested evenly. The weight settled gradually. Another child remained seated while putting on their garment, rising only after it was properly in place. Both methods were acceptable. What mattered was attention. Once worn, the wool felt warm and grounding. It pressed gently against the body, reminding the children to move with care. Quick movements felt inappropriate now. The children stood still for a while, simply feeling the weight. This stillness was intentional. Wool demanded it. One child adjusted the collar slightly, then stopped. Another smoothed the front of the garment once, then again. These adjustments were slow and measured. The room seemed quieter with the wool on, as though the fabric absorbed sound. Even the fire felt softer. The children returned to sitting, lowering themselves carefully. Wool changed how chairs felt, how backs rested against them. They noticed this without comment. Time passed gently. The garments remained still. Nothing shifted unexpectedly. Everything stayed where it was placed. The children placed their hands on their knees and sat quietly, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady. The wool held its shape, offering warmth without demand. The weight of wool encouraged patience. It made the morning feel slower, deeper, more settled. Nothing else happened. And that was enough. The children's hands rested calmly in their laps, partially hidden by the sleeves of wool and linen. They were small hands, still learning their place in the world, but already familiar with routine. These hands had buttoned, smoothed, folded, and adjusted many times before. They were learning something beyond dressing. They were learning patience. For a while, the hands did nothing at all. Doing nothing was not considered wasted time in the noble household. Stillness allowed the body to settle and the mind to quiet itself. The children breathed slowly, barely aware of it, while their hands remained relaxed and open. One child lifted a hand slightly and examined it, turning it palm upward and then palm downward. The movement was slow and thoughtful. Fingers flexed gently, then rested again. This was not play. It was awareness. Another child placed their hands together, fingertips touching lightly. They held them there for a moment, then separated them again. The action was simple, repetitive, and calming. The room remained quiet. The fire continued its low, steady sound. Light from the window rested on the children's sleeves, showing the texture of the wool and the careful stitching along the cuffs. Eventually, one child reached toward a loose thread they had noticed earlier. It was not urgent. The thread had been there before and would likely remain. Still, the child touched it gently, rolling it between their fingers. They did not pull. Pulling would have been quick. Instead, they simply felt the thread, then let it go. Patience sometimes meant leaving things exactly as they were. Another child practiced opening and closing their hands slowly, one finger at a time. The movement took longer than necessary, but necessity was not the goal. Control was. The children had been told, many times without words, that rushing made hands clumsy. Slow hands learned better. A small adjustment was made to a cuff. Then another. Then nothing. Time passed quietly, without markers. The hands returned to resting positions, palms down, fingers relaxed. The children sat upright, shoulders steady under the weight of wool. The clothing did not shift. Everything stayed as it should. One child noticed that their sleeve had slipped back slightly, revealing more of the wrist than before. They considered adjusting it, then decided not to. The sleeve would settle on its own. This decision, to wait rather than act, was also a lesson. The other child lightly brushed their palm against the fabric of their trousers, smoothing it once. They stopped after a single motion. Repeating it would have been unnecessary. The room seemed to approve of this restraint. Eventually, a servant passed quietly outside the door. The sound of footsteps was soft and distant. The children did not turn their heads. They had learned not to follow every sound with movement. Hands remained still. The children were not bored. Boredom did not enter the room. There was always something to notice: breathing, fabric, light, warmth, even if nothing was happening. After a long pause, one child clasped their hands together loosely and rested them against their lap. The other mirrored the posture without intention. Similarity emerged naturally through calm. The practice of patience continued without instruction. Nothing needed fixing. Nothing needed finishing. The small hands, now quiet and composed, had done their work simply by waiting. They had practiced patience without realizing it, just as they practiced dressing every morning. The routine moved forward invisibly. And for a while longer, the children remained seated, hands still, minds calm, allowing the morning to continue at its own gentle pace. The coats waited nearby, folded neatly, and placed where they could be reached without effort. They were heavier than the garments already worn, structured and deliberate, meant to be the final layer. Because of this, they were never put on quickly. The children looked at the coats without touching them. This pause was important. Once the coats were on, the morning would feel more complete. Completion deserved a moment of reflection. They remained seated, back straight, hands resting calmly in their laps. The weight of the wool beneath the coats already encouraged stillness. Adding another layer required readiness. One child stood and stepped closer to the coat, then stopped. Standing was not yet a decision to act. It was simply a change in position. They waited, breathing evenly, feeling the floor beneath their shoes. Another child stayed seated, watching without expectation. There was no order enforced. Each child learned to recognize their own moment. The coat remained folded, its sleeves tucked inward, its buttons unfastened. It looked exactly as it should. Eventually, the first child lifted the coat carefully, using both hands. The fabric felt heavier than wool, firmer, more structured. They did not put it on immediately. Instead, they held it, allowing the weight to settle. The second child rose more slowly and followed. They too lifted their coat and held it without movement. This shared stillness felt appropriate. The room remained quiet. Even the fire seemed to pause in acknowledgement. After a long moment, one child turned the coat slightly, checking the inside lining. Everything appeared in order. No correction was needed. Still, they waited. Putting on the coat too soon would have broken the rhythm of the morning. The children had learned to sense when a moment was complete before moving forward. Finally, without signal or instruction, the first child lifted the coat and guided it onto their shoulders. The movement was slow and deliberate. The sleeves were found easily. The coat settled into place with a quiet certainty. The second child followed, adjusting the collar carefully before letting the coat rest fully. Both children stood still afterward, feeling the change. Coats altered posture more than any other garment. They encouraged uprightness and restraint. The children acknowledged this by standing quietly, shoulders relaxed but steady. Buttons were not fastened yet. That would come later. The children returned to sitting once more. This pause after putting on the coat allowed them to notice whether anything felt off. Nothing did. The coats remained open, framing the garments beneath them. They added weight without discomfort, warmth without urgency. Time passed. The pause before putting on the coat had stretched gently into a pause after. This was acceptable. The morning was not measured. Eventually, one child adjusted the edge of their coat slightly, then stopped. Another smoothed the front once. Then nothing else happened. The routine continued, calm and deliberate. The coats were on. The day felt nearer to readiness, but not complete. And so the children waited again, letting the stillness return, preparing quietly for the next small step. With their coats resting open around them, the children sat quietly once more. Dressing had continued, yet somehow it also felt as though it had paused. The room seemed to invite this pause, holding it gently without asking anything in return. In the light from the tall windows, dust became visible. Tiny particles drifted slowly through the air, moving without purpose or direction. They rose, fell, turned, and lingered, guided only by warmth and stillness. The children noticed them almost at the same time, though neither pointed them out. One child tilted their head slightly, following a single speck as it floated upward, then disappeared into the brightness near the window. Another watched a small cluster of dust move together, then separate again. There was no pattern to observe, and that was what made it calming. The children remained still so as not to disturb the air. Even small movements might send the dust away, and watching it felt strangely important. Not important in a useful way, important in a quiet way. The coat stayed open. Sleeves rested naturally at the wrists. Buttons waited without concern. Nothing demanded completion. The fire's warmth created slow currents in the air, and the dust responded gently. The children breathed evenly, barely altering the movement around them. They had learned that stillness allowed more to be seen. One child raised a hand slightly, then stopped. They had considered brushing dust from the sleeve, but decided against it. The dust would move on its own. Interference was unnecessary. The room felt suspended in time. Outside the window, the morning continued, though it did so quietly. Light shifted almost imperceptibly. Shadows softened along the floor. Inside, nothing changed. The children sat upright, coats open, hands resting calmly. They were dressed enough to leave the room, yet they did not. Leaving would come later. Dust continued to drift. A speck settled briefly on the edge of a coat, then lifted again when the air shifted. The child wearing the coat noticed but did not react. Not every sensation required response. One child adjusted their posture slightly, settling back into stillness. The movement caused a brief swirl of dust, which slowly returned to its previous gentle motion. The child watched this happen, then looked away. Time passed, unmeasured. Dressing, though nearly complete, felt ongoing simply because attention remained present. The children understood, in a quiet way, that finishing something did not mean leaving it behind immediately. Eventually, one child reached up and fastened a single coat button. The sound was soft and brief. After fastening it, they stopped, leaving the remaining buttons undone. This partial completion felt correct. The other child did not fasten any buttons at all. Both choices were accepted by the room. Dust continued to move. The children's breathing remained slow and even. Their thoughts were unformed, drifting much like the particles in the air. No plans intruded. No urgency appeared. The morning seemed content to wait with them. After a long while, the children stood, not quickly, not abruptly. Standing caused the dust to scatter and settle again. They watched this briefly, then turned their attention inward. Their clothing shifted slightly as they stood. Coats settled. Sleeves adjusted themselves. Nothing needed fixing. They remained standing for a moment, then sat again. The movement had not been a signal to leave, only a change in position. The dust resumed its slow drifting. The act of dressing had blended into the act of observing. Both were done with the same patience, the same absence of hurry. Nothing else happened. And that was enough. The afternoon light in the east wing of the manor was pale and thin, slipping through tall windows that had not been fully cleaned since the previous season. Dust floated lazily in the air, moving only when someone shifted their weight or when a distant door closed somewhere far away. In this quiet room, several noble children sat in a long line of straight-backed chairs, each with a small wooden table placed in front of them. Upon each table rested a practice garment. These garments were not grand coats or heavy ceremonial robes. They were simple waistcoats, made especially for learning. Each one had a row of small buttons running neatly down the front, identical in size, color, and spacing. The buttons were smooth and dull, designed not to distract the eye or excite the fingers too much. Lady Maribel, the instructor, moved slowly from one child to the next. Her shoes made almost no sound on the rug. She did not rush, and she did not speak often. When she did speak, her voice was low and even, like a clock that had learned to whisper. "Begin again," she said softly. The children lowered their eyes and placed their hands on the fabric. Fingers hesitated for a moment, then began the familiar task. Thumb and forefinger pinched the first button. The other hand guided the buttonhole open. The motion was careful, deliberate, and repeated exactly as it had been many times before. Button. Pause. Buttonhole. Gentle push. Settle. No one hurried. Young Edmund, seated near the window, blinked slowly as he worked. His movements were not clumsy, but they were cautious, as if he were afraid of waking something sleeping inside the room. He completed one button and rested his hands briefly in his lap, as he had been taught. Resting was part of the lesson. Rushing ahead was discouraged. Across from him, Clara adjusted the fabric again and began the next button. Her breathing was steady, matching the slow rise and fall of her shoulders. The buttons made no sound when they slipped into place. Everything about the exercise was quiet. Lady Maribel stopped behind one child and observed. She did not correct him immediately. She watched the fingers try once, then try again. When the button finally passed through the hole, she nodded slightly, though the child did not see it. "Consistency is more important than speed," she said, almost to herself. The room remained still. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, a carriage wheel creaked faintly and then faded away. Inside, the children continued their work, each button receiving the same amount of attention as the last. No button was special. No button was skipped. When a child finished the final button, they did not announce it. They simply folded the garment neatly, smoothing the front with slow palms, and placed it back on the table. Then they waited. Waiting was also part of the lesson. As more children finished, the room filled with quiet pauses. Hands rested. Eyes lowered. Some children stared at the grain of the wooden tables. Others watched dust drifting through the light. After a long while, Lady Maribel spoke again. "We will repeat the exercise," she said calmly. No one sighed. No one complained. The garments were unfolded again. The buttons, patient and unchanged, waited to be handled once more. The children began again from the top. The same motions. The same order. The same careful attention. And as the afternoon light shifted slightly, the room remained devoted to the slow mastery of small buttons, one after another, without urgency, without excitement, and without end. The garments were unfolded once more and laid flat on the small wooden tables. The fabric rested exactly as it had before, unchanged by the earlier practice. Buttons lined the front patiently, neither improved nor worn by repetition. They waited, as they always did, without expectation. The children adjusted their posture before beginning again. Chairs creaked faintly, then fell silent. Feet were placed evenly on the floor. Backs straightened, not stiffly, but comfortably. The room settled into readiness. Lady Maribel stood near the wall, hands folded loosely, observing without expression. She did not signal when to begin. The children knew the moment themselves. Hands moved forward. The first button was approached with the same care as before. Thumb and finger pinched. The other hand guided the fabric. The motion was familiar now, almost automatic, yet still slow. Familiarity did not invite speed. Button through. Pause. The pause mattered. It always did. It marked the end of one action and the beginning of the next. Without the pause, the routine felt incomplete. Across the room, another child worked through the same steps. Their rhythm matched the room rather than their own thoughts. When a button resisted slightly, they stopped. Resistance was not an obstacle. It was simply a signal to slow down. The fabric shifted quietly as more buttons were fastened. No one looked up. No one compared progress. Each child existed in their own small space of repetition. Light from the window had changed subtly since the last exercise. It was softer now, stretching further across the floor. Dust drifted again, briefly noticed, then forgotten. One child reached the third button and realized the alignment was slightly off. The garment did not lie perfectly straight. Without hesitation, they unbuttoned the previous one and corrected it. This reversal was done slowly, without embarrassment. Going backward was allowed. Lady Maribel noticed but did not comment. Another child paused longer than usual between buttons. Their fingers rested on the fabric without moving. This pause was not a mistake. It was listening, to the hands, to the fabric, to the quiet. The routine continued. Button after button found its place. The sound of fabric brushing against itself remained soft and even. The room held this sound easily, without echo. When one garment was fully buttoned, it was not lifted or admired. It was smoothed gently, then folded again in the same careful manner as before. Folding, too, was repeated exactly. Corners aligned. Creases flattened. Hands moved slowly across the surface, then withdrew. The child who finished first waited. Waiting filled the room again. It did not feel empty. It felt complete. Soon, all garments were folded and resting on their tables. The children sat with hands in laps, breathing evenly. Some gazed downward. Others let their eyes rest unfocused on the wall. Lady Maribel took a slow step forward. "We will do it once more," she said, her voice steady and unchanging. No reaction followed. The children reached for the garments again, unfolding them with the same attention as before. Repetition was not punishment. It was reassurance. The buttons waited. As the routine began again, movements became smoother, not faster. Each child knew what came next, but still treated each step as separate and complete. The room remained calm. Nothing outside interrupted. No clock marked the time. The afternoon passed quietly, shaped only by the repetition of small, careful actions. The lesson continued, not toward an end, but within the doing itself. And so the familiar routine repeated again, just as it had before, and just as it would many times after. Steady, silent, and without hurry. The belts were laid out in a neat row along the long table before the children entered the room. Each belt was the same length, the same shade of muted brown, and fitted with a simple brass buckle that reflected almost no light. They had been placed there earlier in the day and had not moved since. When the children took their seats, they noticed the belts but did not comment. Not everything required comment. Some things were simply there. Lady Maribel waited until everyone was seated properly. She checked posture first, then distance from the table, then the placement of hands. Only after these silent inspections did she speak. "Today," she said, "we will practice aligning the belt." No further explanation was given. Each child reached forward and picked up a belt. The leather was smooth from years of careful use. It bent easily but returned to its shape when released. The children held them gently, allowing the weight to settle in their hands. The first task was not fastening. The first task was straightening. The belt was placed flat on the table. Both hands moved along its length, smoothing it from one end to the other. Fingers pressed lightly, removing invisible curves. If the belt twisted even slightly, it was corrected at once. Straightening took time. Some children began at the buckle and moved outward. Others began at the tip and worked inward. Both methods were acceptable, as long as the result was the same. The belt lay flat. Only then were the buckles examined. They were turned slowly, inspected for dust, then aligned so that the frame sat square with the strap. No polishing was required. Cleanliness was assumed. When the belts were sufficiently straight, the children lifted them carefully and wrapped them around their waists. The motion was slow and controlled. Buckles were centered. Straps were threaded through loops one at a time. There was no need to tighten firmly. The purpose was alignment, not restraint. One child adjusted their belt slightly to the left. Another adjusted to the right. Both adjustments were made in silence. The belts did not make noise when moved. Leather brushed fabric softly, then settled. Lady Maribel walked the length of the room, stopping briefly behind each child. She did not touch the belts. She only observed the line they made across the waist, whether it was level, whether the buckles sat calmly in the center. Again, she said quietly. The children loosened the belts and removed them. They placed them back on the table and began the straightening once more. The leather remembered nothing of the previous attempt. It needed attention every time. As the repetition continued, the room grew heavier with stillness. Movements became smaller. Corrections became more subtle. A slight tilt of a buckle was enough to restart the process. No one hurried. No one finished early. The belts were fastened and unfastened several times. Each time, they were returned to the table, smoothed, aligned, and prepared again. The exercise did not build toward completion. It existed only in repetition. Outside the windows, the sky shifted slowly. Inside, the children remained focused on their small task. Eventually, Lady Maribel spoke once more. "That will be sufficient," she said. The belts were folded in half, not rolled, and placed neatly at the edge of the table. Hands returned to laps. Eyes lowered. The lesson ended without announcement. The garments for this lesson were already waiting on the backs of the chairs. Each one was a simple jacket, light enough to lift easily, but structured enough to require care. The sleeves hung straight down, and the cuffs were folded just once, neither loose nor tight. The children stood beside their chairs for a moment before sitting. Standing was part of the preparation. It allowed them to notice the sleeves at rest, how they fell without movement, how they ended at the cuff. Lady Maribel nodded once. The children sat. Each child lifted their jacket carefully, holding it by the shoulders. The weight was even, familiar, and predictable. One arm slid into a sleeve, then the other. The jackets were settled slowly across shoulders and backs. No one rushed to adjust. The sleeves were allowed to fall naturally. Only after a pause did the study begin. Each child extended one arm and looked at the cuff. The cuff was examined without turning the wrist too much. The edge of the fabric was smoothed once, then again. Any unevenness was corrected with gentle pressure from the fingertips. Some cuffs were slightly folded inward. These were unfolded. Others were too loose. These were tightened just enough to sit comfortably. The other sleeve followed. The room filled with small, careful movements, hands sliding along forearms, fabric being straightened, cuffs being aligned so both sleeves ended at the same point. Matching was important, but perfection was not hurried. One child noticed that their left sleeve felt longer than the right. They compared them slowly, holding both arms forward, then adjusting one cuff slightly. When the difference was no longer noticeable, they lowered their arms and rested. Lady Maribel walked quietly between the rows. She watched the sleeves move and then become still. When a cuff was turned incorrectly, she waited. The child usually noticed on their own. Sleeves were lifted again. Cuffs were examined again. The process repeated. This time, the children were asked to fold the cuffs once, then unfold them again. Folding required attention. The crease had to be even. Unfolding required the same care, smoothing out the line that remained. The jackets did not change, but the hands became more familiar with them. After several repetitions, the children rested their hands at their sides. Sleeves hung naturally again. Cuffs remained quiet and settled. "Remove the jackets," Lady Maribel said. The children stood, slid their arms free, and placed the jackets back on the chairs exactly as they had found them. Sleeves were straightened before being left alone. Once seated again, the children waited. Waiting was longer this time. No new task was given immediately. The room held the stillness easily. Jackets rested. Sleeves did not move. Cuffs remained folded just once. At last, Lady Maribel spoke again. "That is enough for today." No one reacted. The lesson ended without ceremony. The study of sleeves and cuffs had been completed, not by finishing, but by repetition and calm attention. Nothing needed to be remembered urgently. The knowledge would remain quietly, ready for the next time sleeves were lifted and cuffs were smoothed. The shoes were already waiting near the wall, arranged in straight lines on the floor. Each pair faced the same direction. The toes pointed forward, and the heels rested evenly against the baseboard. There were no marks on the floor to guide them. The arrangement was remembered. The children entered the room without speaking. They noticed the shoes immediately, though no one stared. Shoes were familiar objects. They did not demand attention. Lady Maribel gestured gently toward the wall. The children walked over and stood in front of their assigned pair. They did not touch them yet. Standing still before an object was part of learning how to handle it properly. After a pause, Lady Maribel spoke. "You may begin." Each child bent slightly and lifted one shoe at a time. The shoes were not heavy, but they were held with care. Soles were checked briefly, not for dirt, but for balance. The children felt the weight in their hands, then lowered the shoes to the floor in front of their chairs. Putting the shoes on was done slowly. One foot lifted. One shoe guided. Heel settled. Foot lowered. The second shoe followed. No one stamped their foot to adjust the fit. Instead, the shoes were nudged gently until they felt even. Laces, where present, were straightened but not tied yet. Once both shoes were on, the children stood still. Lady Maribel walked past them, observing the way the shoes met the floor. She looked for alignment rather than shine. Toes should point forward. Feet should rest evenly. "Remove them," she said calmly. The children bent again and removed the shoes in the same careful order. They placed them side by side on the floor. The shoes were adjusted so the toes lined up evenly. If one was too far forward, it was corrected. This placing mattered. After a moment, the shoes were picked up again and returned to the wall. Each pair was set exactly where it had been before. Heels touched the baseboard lightly. Toes faced the room. The children stepped back and looked. If anything seemed uneven, it was fixed without being asked. The routine repeated. Shoes were lifted. Shoes were worn. Shoes were removed. Shoes were placed. Each repetition was quieter than the last. Movements became smaller. Corrections were made almost automatically. At one point, a child placed one shoe slightly closer to the wall than the other. They noticed it after stepping back. Without hurry, they adjusted it until the distance matched. Lady Maribel nodded once. The shoes were worn again. This time, laces were tied. The tying was not quick. Each lace was crossed, pulled gently, and looped carefully. Knots were checked for symmetry, not tightness. When finished, the children stood still. No walking was required. The shoes were then untied and removed once more. Laces were straightened. Shoes were placed neatly at the wall again. Finally, the children returned to their chairs and sat. Their feet rested on the floor, now without shoes. The shoes remained where they had been left. "That will do," Lady Maribel said softly. The lesson ended quietly. Shoes remained in pairs. The floor remained undisturbed. Nothing needed to be moved again. The stockings were placed in a shallow wooden tray at the center of the table. They were all the same color, a soft, faded gray that did not draw the eye. Each pair had been washed, dried, and smoothed earlier in the day. They lay flat, one atop another, without wrinkles. The children gathered around the table and stood quietly. Standing helped them see the full length of the stockings before touching them. No one reached forward yet. Lady Maribel waited until everyone was still. "Take one pair," she said. Each child lifted a pair of stockings and returned to their place. They laid them flat on the table in front of them. The stockings were separated gently, one placed beside the other. The first step was alignment. The toes were matched carefully. Heels were straightened so they faced the same direction. The length of each stocking was adjusted until both lay evenly. Only after this alignment did folding begin. Each stocking was folded lengthwise, once. The fold was pressed gently with the palm. Fingers smoothed along the crease from top to toe. Any uneven edge was corrected. Then the second stocking was folded in the same way. The children placed the folded stockings together, one on top of the other. They checked that the edges matched. If one extended too far, it was unfolded and folded again. Nothing was rushed. Once aligned, the pair was folded again, this time in half. The motion was slow. The fold was pressed carefully. The stockings now formed a small, quiet rectangle. The children paused. This pause allowed them to observe the result. It was not to admire, only to confirm that the shape was correct. If it was not, the process began again. Lady Maribel moved among them, watching hands fold and unfold. She did not speak unless necessary. Most corrections were made without instruction. After a while, she said, "Unfold them." The children unfolded the stockings completely. The fabric was smoothed flat again. Creases remained faintly, but they were not important. The folding began again. Alignment. First fold. Smoothing. Second fold. Each repetition felt the same as the last. The stockings did not change. Only the familiarity of the hands increased. One child took longer than the others. Their folds were careful, but they hesitated between steps. Lady Maribel stood nearby but did not interrupt. Eventually, the child continued, completing the folds at their own pace. Once all stockings were folded, they were placed back into the wooden tray. Each pair was aligned with the others. The tray slowly filled with neat, quiet rectangles of fabric. The children stepped back from the table. They waited. The room remained still. No new task was given immediately. The tray of folded stockings rested where it was, undisturbed. After some time, Lady Maribel spoke again. "That will be enough." The lesson ended without further instruction. The children returned to their chairs. Hands rested in laps. The tray remained on the table. The stockings had been folded. They were folded again. They were folded correctly. Nothing more was required. The hats were arranged along a narrow bench near the window. Each one was shaped the same way, with a modest brim and a shallow crown. Their color was a soft brown, slightly darker than the wood beneath them. They rested upside down, open side facing the bench, placed at equal distances from one another. The children stood in front of the bench and looked at the hats. They did not touch them yet. The hats had a presence, but not a demanding one. They waited. Lady Maribel stepped closer. "Take one hat," she said quietly. Each child reached forward and lifted a hat using both hands. Fingers touched the brim lightly, avoiding pressure on the crown. The hats were turned upright and held at waist level. Before putting them on, the children examined them. The inside band was checked for twists. The brim was straightened slightly if it curved too much. The hats were not reshaped, only returned to their original form. Then, slowly, the hats were lifted. Each child raised their hat, paused, and then settled it onto their head. The motion was careful, guided by both hands. The brim was adjusted evenly around the face. Once the hat was in place, the children stood still. They did not look at one another. They did not adjust immediately. They waited, allowing the hat to settle on its own. After a pause, small adjustments were made. A brim lowered slightly. A crown centered more carefully. Each movement was minimal. Lady Maribel walked along the line, observing the hats from different angles. She looked at how evenly they sat, not how fashionable they appeared. "Remove them," she said. The children lifted the hats off again, just as slowly as they had put them on. Hats were held briefly in both hands before being placed back on the bench. Each hat was returned upside down, open side resting gently on the wood. The spacing between hats was corrected if needed. The routine repeated. Hats were lifted. Hats were examined. Hats were placed on heads. Hats were removed. The repetition did not change the hats. It changed the attention given to them. At one point, a child placed a hat back slightly closer to another. They noticed the difference and adjusted it until the distance matched. No comment was made. The hats were lifted again. This time, the children were asked to settle them with one hand only. The other hand remained still. This required slower movement. The hats wobbled slightly before resting. After another pause, the hats were removed again. The bench returned to its quiet order. Hats rested upside down, evenly spaced, unchanged. Lady Maribel nodded once. "That is all," she said. The children stepped back and returned to their chairs. The hats remained where they were. Nothing else was added to the lesson. The hats had been lifted, settled, and lifted again, carefully, calmly, and without urgency. The children were now fully dressed. Every garment rested where it should, not because it had been rushed into place, but because it had been adjusted slowly over time. Jackets lay evenly across shoulders. Sleeves ended at matching points. Belts sat level. Shoes rested quietly on feet. Hats were not worn, but waited nearby. Lady Maribel did not announce that the children were finished dressing. Finishing was not a moment that required attention. Instead, she asked them to sit. The chairs were arranged in a wide, orderly row. The children took their places without sound. When they sat, their clothing settled with them. Fabric folded naturally. Nothing resisted. This lesson was about waiting. Hands were placed neatly in laps. Feet rested flat on the floor. Backs remained straight, but not strained. The children faced forward, though there was nothing particular to look at. The room held them in silence. Time passed, though it was not measured. No clock was consulted. The light outside shifted slightly, softening further. Shadows lengthened across the floor, then stopped moving. One child felt the weight of their jacket against their shoulders. Another noticed the gentle pressure of their belt. A third became aware of how evenly their shoes touched the floor. No one moved to correct anything. Stillness was correct. Lady Maribel stood at the front of the room, hands folded. She watched the children wait. Waiting was the final demonstration of order. It showed that nothing needed to be fixed urgently. A small sound came from outside, a distant door, or perhaps a cart moving slowly down the road. It passed without disturbing the room. The children continued to wait. Some blinked slowly. Others breathed deeply and evenly. A few let their attention drift to the quiet weight of their clothing, the way each piece stayed in place without effort. No instructions were given. Waiting continued. This was not rest. It was readiness without expectation. After a long while, Lady Maribel spoke. "You may stand." The children stood together, carefully. Clothing adjusted itself with the movement. Nothing needed to be touched. They remained standing, still and composed. "You may sit again," she said. They sat. The movement was smooth and unremarkable. Chairs did not scrape. Shoes did not shift loudly. Everything returned to its settled state. The children waited again. The lesson did not explain itself. It did not need to. Being fully dressed was not only about wearing garments properly, it was about carrying them calmly, without fidgeting or distraction. After another stretch of silence, Lady Maribel nodded. "That will be enough for today." There was no signal to hurry. The children did not immediately rise. They remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the end of the lesson to arrive gently. When they finally stood, it was without rush. The room stayed quiet. The children stood quietly beside their chairs. They were still fully dressed, just as they had been moments before. Nothing had shifted out of place. The garments rested calmly on their bodies, waiting. Lady Maribel did not ask them to undress quickly. Speed had never been part of the instruction. "We will remove the garments," she said, in the same order they were learned. The children understood. They began with the smallest details. Hands moved first to the cuffs. Sleeves were straightened one final time, then gently rolled back. Jackets were unbuttoned slowly, from top to bottom. Each button was released carefully, as though the fabric might need reassurance. Once unbuttoned, jackets were slid from shoulders and arms. They were not dropped. Each jacket was folded loosely and placed over the back of the chair, sleeves aligned. Next came the belts. Buckles were loosened with a quiet motion. The belts were pulled free and held briefly, then laid flat on the table. Hands smoothed the leather once, straightening it before folding it neatly in half. The children paused. Then came the shoes. Laces were untied carefully. Knots were loosened, not pulled apart. Shoes were removed one at a time and placed on the floor. Each pair was aligned toe to toe, heel to heel, as they had been before. Socks were removed next. Stockings were rolled down gently, never tugged. They were folded loosely and placed beside the shoes. The folding was familiar now and required little thought. The hats, which had been waiting quietly, were lifted and placed back on the bench. They were not worn again. Their purpose for the day was finished. Finally, the children stood in simpler garments. They adjusted nothing further. Everything that needed attention had already been given it. Lady Maribel walked among them one last time. She observed the folded jackets, the straight belts, the paired shoes, and the quiet order of the room. "This is the end," she said calmly. The children nodded. There was no relief in their movement, only completion. They sat once more. The garments rested where they had been placed. Nothing was disturbed. The lesson ended without urgency, exactly as it had begun. The room had returned to a simpler state. Jackets rested on chair backs. Belts lay folded on tables. Shoes remained paired on the floor. Stockings were placed neatly beside them. Nothing needed to be rearranged. This lesson was not about action. It was about leaving things as they were. Lady Maribel stood near the doorway and looked around the room. She did not ask the children to move anything. She did not introduce a new task. She allowed the room to remain unchanged. The children sat quietly in their chairs. Their hands rested in their laps. Their feet touched the floor lightly. They looked forward without focus. "Tomorrow," Lady Maribel said softly, "these garments will be used again." No one responded. The children already knew this. Repetition was expected. Nothing needed preparation beyond careful placement. Lady Maribel walked slowly from one table to the next. She checked that belts were folded evenly. If a belt lay slightly crooked, she straightened it herself, gently, without comment. The children watched without turning their heads. Shoes were examined next. Each pair was nudged into perfect alignment. Heels touched. Toes pointed forward. Stockings were folded again if they had loosened. This checking took time. The room remained still while it happened. Once finished, Lady Maribel returned to the center of the room. She stood there for a moment, saying nothing. Silence filled the space easily. Preparing for tomorrow did not require discussion. It required consistency. The children remained seated. Some blinked slowly. Others listened to the faint sounds of the building settling around them. A distant footstep passed in the corridor and faded away. Nothing changed. Eventually, Lady Maribel spoke again. "That is all you need to remember," she said. The children did not repeat the instruction. Remembering did not require speaking. They remained seated a little longer. Time moved gently. When they finally stood, they did so quietly. Chairs were pushed back only slightly. No sound lingered. The children left the room in an orderly line. They did not look back. The garments remained behind, waiting for the next day. Lady Maribel stayed behind. She adjusted one chair by a small amount. She straightened a jacket sleeve. She smoothed a fold that did not need smoothing. Then she turned off the light. The room rested. Tomorrow would be the same. The next day began quietly, just like the day before. The room looked the same. The chairs were in place. The tables were clean. The garments waited where they had been left. Nothing appeared new. The children entered in the same order as always. They took their seats without speaking. There was no sense of beginning again. It felt more like continuing. Lady Maribel stood near the wall and observed. "Today," she said softly, "we will review." The word did not cause any reaction. Review was familiar. The children stood and approached the tables. They did not reach for anything yet. Standing was enough. The review began with jackets. Each child lifted their jacket and examined it briefly. They checked the buttons without fastening them. They smoothed the sleeves without putting their arms through. The jacket was then placed back where it had been. Next came the belts. They were unfolded and straightened. Buckles were centered. The belts were not worn. They were folded again and set aside. Shoes were lifted and aligned. Laces were straightened but not tied. Shoes were returned to the floor in pairs. Stockings were unfolded, then folded again. The steps were repeated exactly as before. There was no correction needed. Hats were lifted, turned upright, then placed back upside down on the bench. Spacing was adjusted slightly. The review did not ask for improvement. It asked for recognition. Each task was performed once, without repetition. The children did not linger. They did not hurry. They completed each step and moved on. Lady Maribel watched carefully. Occasionally, she nodded. When the review reached its end, the children returned to their chairs. They sat and waited. Waiting followed review naturally. The room felt familiar, almost settled into the routine itself. The garments seemed to belong where they were. The children belonged in their chairs. After a while, Lady Maribel spoke again. "You already know this," she said quietly. The children remained still. Knowing did not require confirmation. The review ended not with a signal, but with the return to stillness. The children waited again, hands in laps, feet resting evenly. Nothing more was asked. The lesson remained complete because it repeated what was already learned. The room felt settled in a way that did not require attention. Nothing had shifted since the review. Chairs remained aligned. Tables held their familiar objects. Garments rested where they belonged, neither prepared nor neglected. The children sat quietly, already dressed in their simplest clothing. There was no sense of anticipation. Anticipation would have suggested change. Lady Maribel did not begin immediately. She allowed the quiet to remain untouched for a while longer. Confidence, after all, did not need demonstration. When she finally spoke, her voice was even. "Today," she said, "we will do nothing differently." The children did not react. They were used to sameness. Sameness was comforting. They stood when asked and moved toward the tables. Hands reached out, not to learn again, but to acknowledge what was already known. Jackets were lifted, then set down again without being worn. Belts were straightened, then folded once more. Shoes were checked for alignment. One shoe was adjusted slightly, then left alone. Stockings were smoothed and returned to their place. Hats were lifted briefly, then placed back upside down. No task required explanation. The children moved through the motions calmly, without hesitation. Their hands remembered where to go. Their eyes did not search for guidance. Nothing needed correction. Lady Maribel watched without intervening. The calm confidence appeared in small details. A button was checked but not fastened. A cuff was smoothed but not folded. A lace was straightened but not tied. These actions did not lead anywhere. They were complete on their own. Afterward, the children returned to their chairs. They sat down carefully, just as they always had. Their posture settled naturally. Their breathing remained even. Waiting followed. This waiting felt different, not uncertain, not expectant. It was the waiting of something already complete. The room held this feeling quietly. Lady Maribel stood near the window and looked out briefly. Light entered the room at the same angle as before. Dust drifted lazily. Nothing suggested urgency. "You are ready," she said softly, without emphasis. Ready did not mean finished. It meant familiar. The children remained seated for a long while. No one moved. No one adjusted clothing. Everything rested where it should. Eventually, Lady Maribel nodded. "That will be enough." The lesson ended gently, without change, without conclusion, just as it had lived. The afternoon did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly into the room, unnoticed at first. The light softened, stretching across the floor without drawing attention to itself. The children remained seated, their presence unchanged. Nothing had been assigned. This was intentional. Lady Maribel remained near the door, standing without purpose. She did not hold a book. She did not watch the clock. She simply remained. The children waited. Some rested their hands loosely in their laps. Others placed them on the arms of their chairs. Feet remained flat on the floor. No one crossed their legs. No one leaned forward. Time passed without markers. At some point, a child shifted slightly in their chair. The movement was minimal. Clothing adjusted itself quietly and then became still again. The room accepted the movement without response. Outside, distant sounds drifted in and faded away. None were close enough to matter. Inside, the silence remained complete. The garments stayed where they had been left earlier. Jackets rested. Belts lay folded. Shoes waited in pairs. Hats sat upside down on the bench. Stockings remained neatly arranged. Nothing required checking. Lady Maribel took a slow step forward, then stopped. She did not speak. The children did not look up. Waiting continued. The afternoon moved on. Light changed again, becoming dimmer but warmer. Shadows stretched longer, then settled. Dust drifted less noticeably. The children breathed evenly. No one slept. No one fidgeted. Stillness was maintained not by effort, but by familiarity. At one point, Lady Maribel quietly adjusted a chair that had shifted slightly. The sound was barely audible. The children remained seated, unchanged. The afternoon continued passing. Eventually, Lady Maribel spoke. "The day is moving on," she said softly. This was not an instruction. It was an observation. The children remained still. A few moments later, she added, "Soon, it will be evening." Evening did not require preparation. The room continued to hold its calm. Nothing needed to be done before the day ended. After a long while, Lady Maribel nodded to herself. "That will be all." The children stood slowly. Their movements were careful, as always. Clothing adjusted quietly. Shoes touched the floor evenly. They did not rush to leave. One by one, they exited the room. The order was calm. The door closed gently behind the last child. Lady Maribel remained alone for a moment longer. She looked around the room, then turned off the light. The afternoon had passed. The room was quiet in a way that felt complete. Not empty, but settled. Chairs remained where they had always been. Tables stood still. The garments rested in their familiar places, unchanged by the passing of the afternoon. Nothing waited to be corrected. Nothing waited to be taught. Lady Maribel entered the room alone. Her steps were slow, measured, and unremarkable. She did not carry anything with her. There was nothing left to bring. She paused near the center of the room and looked around. The jackets lay folded as they should. Belts were straight. Shoes were paired. Stockings rested neatly. Hats remained upside down on the bench, evenly spaced. Everything was as it had been learned. She adjusted nothing. Instead, she stood quietly, allowing the stillness to remain untouched. The light in the room was soft now, resting gently against the walls. Shadows no longer moved. This was not the end of instruction. It was the absence of instruction. The children were not present, but their order remained. Their careful movements had left no trace that required fixing. The room itself seemed to remember. Lady Maribel walked slowly to the window and looked outside. The day had fully settled. There was no urgency to leave. After a while, she returned to the center of the room. She rested her hands together and waited, though there was nothing left to wait for. The lesson had completed itself. Not by reaching a goal. Not by improving further. But by becoming familiar enough to require no attention at all. Eventually, Lady Maribel turned off the remaining light. The room darkened softly. The garments rested unseen, but unchanged. Nothing would be different tomorrow. And that was enough.